Welcome to Multiplication Matters with speaker and author Dr. J.D. Payne. Dr. Payne is the pastor for church multiplication at the Church of Brook Hills in Birmingham, Alabama, and has written several books on the subjects of missions and evangelism. Here's J.D.
Hi, I'm J.D. Payne, and I want to thank you so much for checking out the session today on Multiplication Matters. One of the things that's important for us to think about when it comes to the multiplication of disciples and leaders in churches in North America and throughout the world is that it's important for us to understand our community in which the Lord places us to serve. The book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 2, says that desire without knowledge is not good. Whoever makes haste with his feet misses the way. And so it's this notion of we can have a lot of zeal and we can be passionate about what we're doing for the Lord, but oftentimes if that zeal is not wed with a healthy dose of knowledge, then oftentimes that zeal may take us on a direction that may lead us in a path that we may not want to go down when it comes to our ministries, to the things with our churches, the things with our missionary teams that we're sending out. So I want to spend today talking to you about ways to understand or ways to develop knowledge about our communities, about our context where the Lord calls us to serve. Now, this is obviously very, very critical for church planting teams that we're sending out to go plant churches across the city, across the country, or into other countries as well. But this is not just something that these missionary bands are to be in the know about, but also those of us in established churches need to be aware of these matters as well. For oftentimes we get into a rut and we forget about what's happening outside of our Christian context and what's happening in the community at large around us. So today I want to talk about these 7 ways to understand our context, 7 ways to understand our community. The first thing that I want us to understand here as we jump into this is that this understanding is to help us to know how better to communicate the gospel message to those that live around us that do not know Christ, and how best to share this truth with them. So it's not understanding for the sake of understanding's sake, but it moves us to the practical reality of as we go making disciples. Number 1, how we understand our community. We need to understand our community geographically. Now you say, well, what does that mean? Well, the reality is, in many places in the world, many cities of the world, geography defines people. Whether we like it or not, oftentimes we have class boundaries that come about in cities and towns and communities and countries. Wealthy's over here, poor's over here. High crime rate over here. This is a safe neighborhood to live in, and that is important for you to understand what is going on in your city. Now, one of the things on understanding your community geographically is that oftentimes natural, such as ponds, rivers, lakes, natural barriers, and even man-made barriers, such as interstate systems, freeway systems, parks that have been developed, oftentimes those will create these barriers among people whereby people on one side may not pass over to connect with people on this side and vice versa. You've heard the phrase before, wrong side of the tracks. You know, he grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. She's from the wrong side of the tracks. You know, what does that usually mean? It means that, you know, on the other side of the tracks, that's the bad neighborhood. That's the area that you don't want to be a part of, especially after 6 o'clock in the evening or something like that. And what is that statement? Well, it's the railroad, when it was put in, that just didn't automatically create a good side and a bad side, a healthy side and a high crime rate side. But what it did do is that over time, it divided communities. And so looking at a map of your community, Google Maps is great, but looking at a map of your community, ask yourself the question when you see these natural and man-made significant barriers, are there divisions there? In other words, are there peoples living in these different areas in our city, in our town, that maybe we're not reaching, and maybe we're not effectively reaching them because we have a cultural understanding of who we are as people, and they're in a different cultural context. So maybe we need to send a team out to begin to work among them. So who are your people? Understanding that context geographically is important. Number 2, second thing, understand your people demographically. You're wanting to understand, the population. Is it growing? Is it declining? Is this a community? Is this an area of our town where there are a large number of children? What are the the income levels of the people. What are the crime rates that are there? Demographics is basically stats about people, and it helps you get an understanding of the general population that is there. And that information is often made available online, and you can find that in many places. The U.S. government makes it available based off of oftentimes of our census data that's collected every 10 years, and then other studies that will come out at various points between those census collection times. The Canadian government does, I think, even a better job. They usually kick out their information about every 5 years. And so understand your people demographically. It helps you get an idea of who they are. Third way to understand your context, understand your community, is to understand people culturally. You want to understand them culturally, and what that means is what are their values, what are they passionate about, what are their hurts, what are their fears, what are the things that excite them, are they really into kids' sports, or are they really into outdoor recreation, or do they not even really have any hobbies at all? All these questions are cultural questions, because culture gets at really kind of a lot of the heart issues of people, how they think, how they live, how they move, and what they do in their homes and in their communities that are around them. And understanding people culturally is very critical to getting a better understanding of the people that live around you wherever you're serving. Fourth way that we understand people is to understand them spiritually. So what are their religious beliefs? Right now in the United States, the rise of people with no religious preferences is increasing very significantly, with what we refer to as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, no religious preference whatsoever. Are they coming from a major world religion with all the immigration that is coming into the western part of the world, particularly in the United States? Now, how do these people live when it comes to spiritual values? What are their spiritual values? And look around your communities. I mean, do you see temples? Do you see mosques? Do you see occultic bookstores, New Age bookstores, Christian Science reading rooms? What do you see around the area that's around you? And oftentimes that will help you get an understanding of the practices of the people that are in those areas. Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes, particularly with people that have migrated to the United States in particular, there may be a large temple in one area of the city, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a large number of people that are followers of that particular faith in that city, but it could very well mean that that's the case. But it also could mean that that temple is there, but people are driving from an hour and a half away, and they're all coming in. So again, this is just to help us get an idea, get an understanding of our cultural context, where people are spiritually. Fifth way that we need to understand our people in our communities is to understand them historically. We need to understand them historically, because the past is always built on, the present is always built on the past. And so whether we like it or not, there is a history that's there. And right now, I'm a part of living in the city of Birmingham, and we have been recently reminded of the 50th anniversary of the celebration of some of the major events that were taking place in the civil rights movement back many years before I even showed up, or even before I was born. But the reality is that as a pastor here in Birmingham today, there are issues that are in our city that I am facing and that I'm engaging that affect the communication of the gospel, and it's based on things that happened 50 years ago and even more. And so the past influences the present. So what is the history of the people? Particularly if you're working among a people group, if you're working among refugees, that's going to be critical. Understand people's history, understand their past, understand what came before you, understand what's been taking place in their lives before they even came onto the scene. Another way to understand people is to understand them politically. Now, in the United States, we often think about that in terms of understanding Republicans and Democrats and maybe independents. And that is one way that we can look at it. But if you're working among people groups that have migrated from other countries, you also need to begin to understand them politically based on what they were in their country from where they immigrated. Because they may be registered as Democrat or they may be registered as Republican in this country, but they will still be shaped by a lot of their thinking politically when they were back home. I remember one time I was in a taxi with a Haitian driver, and I was just asking him if he stayed in contact with family back in Haiti, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "the Haitian community here in the metro New York area, we're very large in number, and we still stay very much in tune with the things that are happening politically back in our country of birth." And so recognize that understanding people politically is extremely important as well. And then finally, finally, last way to understand our community and understand our context, and this is more particular to those that are doing cross-cultural work in the West or even outside of the West, and you're primarily maybe an English speaker, and that is you need to understand people linguistically. You need to understand their language, their heart language, and how they communicate. And so understanding simple phrases, getting an understanding of their language is a part of understanding their culture and who they are, and that's critical to the understanding process as well. I hope that as we think through some of these ways to understand our people, and at least in these 7 different ways, that this has been helpful to you. I hope you'll begin to think through this week, how can I better understand my community where the Lord has placed me to serve? I hope this has been a blessing to you and helpful to you in what you're doing for His kingdom.
Join us next time for another installment of Multiplication Matters with Dr. J.D. Payne.